Let's begin with a prayer. Father, we thank you for the things that we've learned so far, and as the next couple of weeks, we begin to come to a close, and we bring it into this century and a little closer to home. I pray you take the instruction and use it, Lord, for your glory. Continue to give us that deeper appreciation for the work that your Son has wrought. And as we look tonight at kind of a philosophical aspect of humanity that's called humanism, I pray that you would help us to understand some of these abstract thoughts and so on, because it is difficult to do in light of the simplicity of your gospel. But I pray that you'd help us to do that, Lord, not only so that we might understand what you've done better, but that we might also gain a deeper burden for those that are caught up in that sort of thing. So we dedicate this time to you and pray that your Spirit would be the teacher, and we just really do thank you for giving us this time and place. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, tonight our class is going to be on humanism. This is the 6th week of our course. But before we begin, if you'll turn over your short quiz, we'll have a real quick one on last week's class, the New Age movement. It's just 10 true and false questions. Just ought to be able to whip right through it. There's no trick questions, as I always say, but you want to read things carefully. If you read it too fast, you might miss something. But I don't have any hidden. And as always, once you finish, turn your test over so I can know when everybody's done. Okay, if you turn your tests back over, we'll run through them real quickly. Theosophy openly embraces all theologies, including Christianity. True or false? False. Okay, it embraced everything except monotheistic religions. If you remember the quote from Madame. Okay, the headquarters for the entire New Age movement is located in Skokie, Illinois. True or false?
False.
False. Everyone knows it's just outside of Poughkeepsie. Okay, Helena Blavatsky was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. True or false?
True.
True. Benjamin Cream is the self-appointed John the Baptist for the New Age movement. True or false? True. Kuthumi is the New Age Messiah. True or false? False. Lord Maitreya was the spirit guide that appeared to Madame Blavatsky. False. Okay, who was Kuthumi? And who is Lord Maitreya? Okay, just those two are reversed, and they're both false statements as they appear on your test. Okay, the goal of the New Age movement is to initiate the plan. True or false? True. An integral part of the New Age networking is the spin. True or false? True. The euphemism traditional healers is a term for medical doctors. True or false? False. Okay, it's a term for witch doctors and shamans. New Agers believe that Jesus did not exist. True or false? False. Okay, they think he was one of the lesser of the great masters. Okay, easy test. All right, turn to your outlines for this evening, and we'll look into humanism. Basically, in human times, in the history of mankind, humanism as a school of thought has had three heydays, or there's been three periods of existence. One, the first time would be, remember when we talked about the Greek culture and the Greek philosophies, how that was the beginning of humanism as a school of thought. Humanism is basically evaluating all existence beginning as the focal point man, and evaluating everything, in other words, man being the center of the universe, everything emanating out from man. This is basically humanism. And as a school of thought, it had its beginnings in Greek philosophy. Then the second time of its heyday was during the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th century, which was basically, the word Renaissance means rebirth, which was a rebirth of the Greek classical period. And it was during this time that also the humanism as a school of thought was cooking. And then in the 20th century, with the advent of what we would call secular humanism, which is actually a misnomer, and we'll see that as we get into that later on. But aside from that, aside from the fact that there have been three periods of history where humanism as a school of thought has been prevalent, there have been many, innumerous humanistic acts. And we can see these from Scripture. If you brought a Bible, let's turn to Genesis chapter 3, and we'll just look at a few examples in Genesis. If you remember the foundational class of anthropology, we went through these. And so just for a little refresher, we'll look at some of the humanistic acts that man had in his very early days. The first one being in Genesis chapter 3, the fall. Starting with verse 1. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Okay, well, here we see the beginnings of the humanistic act in taking the command of God and making it sound much worse than, making it sound like a bad thing. He said we can't even touch it. And God never said that. He just said, don't eat it. And the serpent said to the woman, You shall not surely die. And here we see the temptation of the humanistic act coming in here with the first lie. You shall not surely die, for God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Okay? So as soon as they took that rutabaga and took a big old chomp out of it, they knew good from evil. They had just committed evil. And so they were no longer innocent. The age of innocence had ceased. And they knew what disobedience was because they had just done it. And so in doing so, they saw that they were naked, and they sewed the fig leaves together and covered themselves. They recognized their own nakedness and immediately set to work trying to cover that up. Okay, so here was an example of, I know what God has said, but my wants, my desires, my needs are more important. And so I will do what I want to do regardless. Okay, then in chapter 4, we know about Cain and Abel, the story about Cain and Abel. Of course, this would be considered a humanistic act. But a lesser-known story that in Genesis chapter 4, beginning with verse 19, one of the descendants of Cain was named Lamech. And it says in verse 19, Then Lamech took for himself two wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the second was Zillah. And Adah bore Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. and his brother's name was Jubal. And he was the father of all those who play the harp and the flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Then Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. O wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Remember when God put that mark on Cain, and Cain said, my punishment is more than I can bear, and you know, surely if anybody sees me, they'll kill me. And God said, well, I'll put this mark on you, and if anyone does, then I'll avenge you sevenfold. And so Lamech says, well, if Cain, now remember this was God who said, I will avenge him sevenfold. And so here's Lamech who he's killed a guy who crossed him. Okay, this guy messed with his space. We don't really know what exactly he did. He says wounding him, whether this is physically or emotionally or what. This guy made him mad, and so Lamech killed him. And his boast in response to this act was, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, in other words, if God said that he'll take care of Cain, and he shall avenge him sevenfold for anything that anybody does to him, then I will take care of myself 77-fold. I don't need God. You know, Cain might have needed God, but I'm a man's man. I'm a real man. I don't need that crutch. And so here we see the beginning of a humanistic mentality, taking those humanistic acts that we see with Adam and Eve and Cain early on, and then we see this mentality beginning to develop. And then that mentality began to take on corporate structure, we see in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Okay? Now, I know back in Sunday school years ago when we studied this, the little cartoon or the little pictures that we got in the Sunday school class showed this big, huge spiral tower that just went on up into the clouds, and you know, and the people were way up there above the clouds. And they were trying to build this tower clear up to heaven, and I really don't think that's precisely what was going on. When you study Babylonian culture, remember when we looked at them in the second week, and remember the ziggurats, those big edifices that were kind of a type of pyramid. They were the big kind of stair-stepped type of temples that the people built. Well, that's probably what they were doing. But basically, what they were doing was not trying to build something to heaven to where they could, build. They just wanted to build a bridge up to the streets of gold. That wasn't the mentality that they had. The mentality that they had was that we are so cool, and we're going to build this big temple so that we can show everybody how cool we are. Even, and everybody will go, oh, wow, they're so cool. Even God. And so that was the mentality that was behind what they were doing, and that's what caused God to make that statement, that if I let them continue in this, then nothing they desire to do will be withheld from them. And I wonder, every time I read this passage, I think about, 1980s technology and coming into the 1990s technology with the strides in medicine and what man is attempting to do with genetics and DNA and test tube life forms and all of this. And I just wonder at what point God is going to say, if I let them do that, whatever that might be in the future, then nothing they desire will be withheld from them. And I think what I'll do is step in. And so it's kind of almost prophetic in a way, I think. Okay, so here we see some humanistic acts. But as a school of thought, As I said earlier, humanism had its beginnings with the Greeks, primarily with the Greek philosophy, and then in turn being manifested in their gods. Remember what a Greek god, your typical Greek god, looked like. He just looked like a real well-endowed man that lived forever. And maybe he had some specific powers that were that went along with whatever he was the god of, that would give him some certain mystical, magical powers. But as far as mentality and oftentimes physical prowess and so on, he was even inferior to men. And so we can see that mentality that they had of their gods, you know, when the Greek philosophers were really beginning to cook and began to look at things from a very horizontal plane. You know, they didn't believe that there was anything up on top of Olympus other than snow. But the mentality that was behind the Greek idols carried over into their philosophy. And hopefully we'll see that as we go through it. This was probably the focal point of all Greek philosophy, is what's known as dialectic, or the dialectic method. And this is basically an attempt to make a statement or to present a case, to prove a point, by the use of a dialogue between 2, 3, or 4 individuals. And the philosophers would use this. Usually they would have one guy who would be the good guy, and then the other guys would be his challengers or something, or maybe he would be the challenger against these other guys. And they would have this dialogue back and forth on, you know, why do oranges have navels? And they would talk these things back and forth, and then the guy that was really trying to present the point would have an argument that would just leave the other guy speechless. In the end, after everybody had presented the case, then this one guy would finally have the last word. And this is what's known as the dialectic method, or dialectic. And the father of dialectic is known as Heraclitus. He was the first dialectician, is the title that goes with that. And he viewed the universe as, you know, his views and everything was very pioneering. I mean, he was the one who began this sort of thing. So there was, the guys took what he had and then built upon it. But he viewed the universe in 2 ways. One is that everything had opposite poles. Every day had its night, every plus had its negative, every black had its white, every up had its down, every hot had its cold, every wet had its dry, and so on. Everything had opposite poles. And he tried to evaluate everything in that light. And his dialogues were always trying to present that. And the second thing is that he believed that the entire universe was fluid. In other words, nothing stood still. Everything was always moving, and there was no constant. And he would do this by, you know, if someone was wanting to talk about, you know, just even someone from the Heraclitean school of thought today, if they were discussing things like the speed of light. Okay, the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second, okay? So that's the light that it takes, or that's the time that it takes a piece of light to go from here to here, is 186,000 miles a second. But what if here is moving? You know, if everything in the universe is always moving, and this is moving, then the time that it goes from here to here isn't 186,000 miles a second, because the beginning point isn't constant. And so this would be one of the things about all, you know, and as though it makes a big difference. But this would be the sort of things that Heraclitus would talk about. Okay, one of his disciples was a guy named Socrates. Socrates was also a dialectician. And both of these guys did their dialectics verbally. Okay, as they would sit around in the forum or in their schools, and their students would sit at their feet and listen to them, and they would just say, and so says, and then the farmer says, and then the barber says, and they would just do this verbally. And this was the way their students learned. They would just sit there and kind of listen to them. Consequently, their stuff isn't written down. And it's kind of hard to pin them down on some of their various views, because all we have is what their students wrote down later, what they had to say or what they felt about specific subjects. And so probably the greatest dialectician of all, and the first one to put his thoughts into writing, was Plato. Plato's dialogues. Most of Plato's works are still, they're demanded reading in most college courses and stuff. And his dialogues are just these dialectic arguments that he would have between different individuals. And if you remember in the Greek, when we were looking at the Greek course, that one of the problems with this is Plato never did identify himself in these dialogues, and he never did identify the position that he was taking. And sometimes he would win an argument over on this side of the fence for the fact that day is the opposite of night, and then the next time he would win this argument, or whoever the hero of the dialogue would win the argument over there's no difference between day and night, or this sort of thing. And so it was really kind of hard to pin him down on things such as his concept of God, concept of good and evil, and this sort of thing. Possibly, and the more I see, the more I look into this, I see the validity of this, and a lot of guys that I've read have said this. Possibly what Plato was trying to present was the idea that there are no absolutes, that it doesn't matter, that you can't, day and night, same thing. It's not the same thing. What difference does it make, sort of thing. Okay, there were a couple of things, though, that he did fairly nail down, that it was fairly clear as to what his views were. One is that he believed that the only concrete things in the universe are thoughts. It's what he called the logos, his expressed concept. He believed that thoughts were eternally real. Remember, the Greeks believed in the eternity of the universe, the eternality of the universe, that it always existed. All the spirits, all of the souls, all of the atoms, everything in the universe was always there in some form or another. And so therefore the thoughts, this was Plato's concept of God, more than likely. And there have been a lot of liberal scholars who have taken the John 1:1 expression of the Logos and tried to make a Platonic application, trying to say that John was a Platonist, and nothing could be further from the truth. John was just simply taking the terminology that people would be familiar with and applying the scriptural truth behind it, in the same way that the Holy Spirit did with the word agape. It's defined, even though that word existed, it didn't mean to a classical Greek what it meant to a New Testament reader, because the Holy Spirit redefined it within the context of the New Testament. And so we can see this in several cases, and so that's the same as it is with Logos. But Plato's view of the Logos was that of thought, capital T, eternal thought, being God, this impersonal logic. But the unreal things of the universe, the things that are just perceived to be real, is that which is sensually perceived. Our feelings, our hearing, our sight, and these sort of things. What we would normally consider to be physical, empirical stuff, to Plato was not real. And he called these things phenomena. He said, man can have knowledge of ideas. Okay, we can know ideas because thoughts are eternally real. Man can have knowledge of ideas, but only opinion about phenomena. I can say that this is a lectern. Okay, you could say that's your opinion. I say it's a piece of wood. And someone else could say, well, that's your opinion. I say it's a bunch of molecules. And so on and so on and so forth. And we'll get into more. This is in philosophy, this is what's known as particulars, and we'll talk about that probably in the second half. But this is one of the things of Plato. He says, but the fact that I can get into a concept of what this is, an idea, that is reality. My idea of what this is a reality. But when what it really is not real. Okay, and remember the sophist. Remember we talked about the sophist, the wise guys. These were the guys that charged for their services. The first, probably the father of sophism, was Protagoras. Protagoras, you see his dates here in the 5th century. And he made the statement, let me write this on the board, because this is about as foundational of humanism as you can get. And this was the quote that he's famous for. Man is the measure of all things. That was his beginning point. See, this was this was when, remember when we talked about the Egyptians, how they didn't really worry about things like this. As long as they can get, turn on the gas and the fire came out, that's all they worried about. I mean, as long as it worked, that was good enough for them. And they didn't really worry about things like this. And it was the Greeks that began to talk about things like logic and reason. And, the Egyptians were just worried about how you can add up all these complicated fractions. Well, the Greeks, on the other hand, would think, okay, if I have a line like that, and then I cut it in half, then I've got half of that line. Then if I cut it in half again, I've got half again. And if I cut it in half again, I've got half. And they would keep doing that in their minds until, what do you do when you get down to a place to where you can no longer cut it in half anymore? Which in geometry we call that a point. Okay, that would be when you could break something down. And they had this idea. Of course, they didn't really know anything about atoms and that sort of thing, but they had this idea that you could continually reduce the size of something until it had no dimensions. And they looked at that. Okay, well, if we transfer that into the physical world, then nothing in the physical world has substance, because it's made up of a bunch of non-measurable particulars or items. So they would do that, and they'd say, okay, but you got to have a beginning point. And so this is what Protagoras did. He said, man is that beginning point. He is the measure of all things. And so we start with man and then evaluate the entire universe from that. This was a very optimistic view, because any problem that came about, if Socrates didn't have the answer, then he said, well, Plato will figure it out, because that was Socrates' disciple. If Plato didn't have the answer, then he said, well, Aristotle will figure it out, because he was Plato's disciple, and so on. They figured if we can't do it, the guys after us will, because we know we're on the right track. Man is the measure of all things, and so we'll just continue to keep on thinking about it and continue to work out the bugs, and someday we'll have all things figured out, and we'll have all the answers solved. And we will know why we're here. We'll know why oranges have navels, and we'll know all of those things someday. And it was very optimistic. Okay, Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things, and he said that then he would say, okay, well, if man is the measure of all things, I'm a man, you're a man, he's a man, then what is truth? There is no truth. Because what I say is true, you might disagree with, and he might disagree with. And so, therefore, he said there is no truth, but if truth could be found, it would have to be in morals and ethics. Because since we are just higher forms of animals, we are moral beings, and if there is such a thing as truth, which I don't think there is, but it must be found in morals and ethics. Of course, the skeptic philosophers of later years tore that all to pieces. But this was kind of where he was coming from in the early days. Okay, Gorgias, he was a contemporary of Plato around this same time period, a little bit later than Protagoras. Plato was the end of the 5th century and beginning of the 4th century BC. And Gorgias was the contemporary, and he argued that there is no being. Okay, and that was the whole thing of cutting things down to where they no longer had any dimensions. Well, this was the thing that Gorgias was really into. And he said there is no such thing as being, because we're all made up of non-dimensional particulars. Okay, a particular is anything. You could say that each one of us in this room are a particular. the group is a particular. The people in our Bible college are a particular. Our church is a particular, and so on. Anything is a particular. And since everything is made up of non-dimensional particulars, then there's no such thing as being. But, he said, if there is a being, if there is such thing as being, it can't be known, because it's made up of non-dimensional things. And if it can be known, see, first of all, he said there's no such thing as being, but then he said if there is, it can't be known. And then he said if it can be known, it can't be communicated. In other words, if my esoteric, cosmic, Gnostic mind could ever come up with a concept of what I just said and understand it, there's no way I could ever explain it to you, because there's no way words could ever express it. So that was Gorgias. He was also a very immoral person. You know, it was kind of to thine own self be true, and that was his whole approach to things. Okay, and then we come to the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth. And just in case you didn't hear me, I think I'll write that on the board for some reason. Rebirth. The word Renaissance means rebirth. Probably the father of the Renaissance was a guy by the name of Petrarch. He was a poet. You see the years that he lived here. Okay, about the middle of the 14th century, as we can say, is the beginning of the Renaissance period. And the Renaissance was basically a renewed interest in the Greek classics, or all of the classics. In fact, initially, it was just a renewed interest in scholastics, music, science, and you know, the Greeks and the Egyptians, all of the strides that they made in science, there had been no change for all these hundreds of years. And now, with the beginning of the 14th century, there is a renewed interest in this. In fact, in the beginning, these classics even included manuscripts of the Bible. You know, as the guys were going back and reading Plato and Euripides and all of these guys, they also began reading some of the old Greek manuscripts of John and Paul and some of these other guys. But that was kind of short-lived. At one point in his life, Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux. And when he was asked why, his answer was, because it's there. And so if you ever wondered where that came from, he was the guy that did it. It was just like, you know, it wasn't that he didn't have anything against God or anything like that. In fact, he appreciated what God had done, that he had made this magnificent creature called man, and that man could go out and sit down in the middle of a park and watch leaves fall and think that was just a great thing to do, you know. And so it wasn't that he didn't even eliminate God. It's just God really doesn't, you know, God's glad that I'm sitting here watching these leaves fall and enjoying it, or going out and looking at a spider web covered with dew in the morning. You know, that's a neat thing to do. And what he did was say, that's the most important thing a man can do, because that's what I want to do right now. I want to go climb that mountain because it's there, and I think that would be a neat experience. So my calling right now is to go climb that mountain. And so that was, as he began expounding these sort of views, that was kind of the beginning of the Renaissance mentality. Okay, the church during this time, if you remember from your church history class, that this was a period probably during the lowest ebb of the church. This was a time when the selling of indulgences was a common practice. You know, if you look at this time period here, this is not too far before Martin Luther. And St. Peter's in Rome had been built several centuries before by the Roman Church. And, you know, it was several hundred years old now, and it needed a paint job, as well as some plaster repairs and everything else. And they needed some money to do this. And so the church was involved in various activities to raise money. And a couple of the most prevalent ways, one was the selling of indulgences. And this was, in the beginning, the selling of indulgences kind of evolved, but in the beginning it was simply just, if you fell and committed some sin, you would go down to the church and you would pay so much money and you'd be absolved from that sin. that worked for a time, but then when they really wanted to make money, they would just come in, and it evolved into an idea that you didn't even have to wait until you sinned. You know, if you were wanting to go out on Saturday night and tie one on, you just went down Friday night and bought an indulgement. You bought a tie one on indulgement, and then you were covered. You know, it was okay. You were clear for that day. And so this was a very common practice during this time. And another one of the things that was also very prevalent was the idea that you could buy the souls of your loved ones out of purgatory. You know, and the little jingle that was so popular then, when the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And there was this idea, you know, everybody went. The only way you didn't go to purgatory is if you died immediately after you were baptized, before you had a chance to commit any sins, or if you were martyred. And everybody else had to go to purgatory to, you know, work off this bad karma. And so so they had this thing that was going around to where you could, you know, if you had a loved one that was in purgatory, you could give so much money and you would buy them some good time and get them out of purgatory, and then they could go on to heaven. So this was the state of the church during this time. So just, you know, the Reformation aside, the church, as far as, okay, all of a sudden mankind is beginning to think, mankind is beginning to look at things, that, you know, the Renaissance is going on. They're going back and reading these non-Christian, secular, you know, Greek heathens and seeing what heavy-duty things they had to say. Not only the philosophers, but the poets that were affected by the philosophers and the idols of that day. And an educated man, you know, any man who knew how to read and write and had any knowledge at all, would look on one hand over here at what the church was saying. You know, the church was saying this is what reality is. You know, you buy indulgence. Well, an educated man knew better than that. You know, just setting the Reformation aside and just setting the spiritual thing aside, just a man trying to decide which road am I going to take, sort of thing. And so as the scholars of the day looked at what the church had to offer, they just naturally kind of went the other way. But there were some scholars, even still, that were within the church, and probably the most famous of them was St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century. You see, he's a little bit before Petrarch. And of his day and age, he was probably the most educated man, if not within the church, at least on earth. This was in the beginning of this whole renewal of learning how to read and write and so on. And he was a Dominican monk who was just really infatuated with the teachings of Aristotle. Now remember, Aristotle was a pagan. Aristotle believed that there was definitely a creator. Remember, he's the one who looked out at the universe and said, man, there had to be a designer. But he was very clear that his view of that designer was impersonal, that he didn't believe in a personal creator. But there was some force, some cosmic wow out there that made it happen. And Thomas was a student of his. And there was a couple of errors that Thomas made that, you know, kind of shifted him off in the wrong direction. And one of these was that he failed to make any clear-cut distinctions between the heavy-duty things that Aristotle had to say and the heavy-duty things that Paul had to say, or John, or any of the other biblical writers. He really kind of lost that distinction between God's Word and just the good stuff that man has wrote and philosophized about. He seemed to place revelation and human reasoning on an equal footing. Now, whether or not he did that in his own mind or not, I'm not sure, but his writings definitely project that. And another one of his errors, and this is even more theological than that, is that he had a misconception about the fall. He didn't believe in the total depravity of man. He didn't believe in imputed sin. He believed that the only thing that fell in the Garden of Eden was man's will, but his mind was still pure. And so therefore, in his logic was that if the mind could be instructed correctly, if you just put the right stuff into the mind, then the man himself will become good. In other words, we're basically good. And that mentality, there's still, even today, the Catholic Church puts a lot of stock into Thomas Aquinas' teachings. His writings he's still being taught in the seminaries and so on. And there are a lot of human development psychologists and so on today that still hold to that type of view. That if you just, if you give the kid, you take a kid and you give him the right type of training, you wipe his nose and teach him to wash behind his ears and give him proper education and 3 glasses of milk a day and all these sort of things, then he'll grow up and he'll be a good guy. That's all it takes, is just putting the right input into the mind. And so those were 2 of the problems with Aquinas. Okay, we'll take a look at a couple of these guys from the Renaissance before the break. Probably 2 of the greatest examples of Renaissance man were Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. They were both fairly contemporary with each other. Michelangelo went through an evolution of his own during his lifetime, so it's hard to say that this was what Michelangelo thought or felt, because what he felt early on in his work wasn't necessarily reflected later on in his work. And so unless you look at a particular sculpture or painting, you'd have to know at what period in his life this was done, in other words, to properly evaluate it. But one of the most famous of Michelangelo's work is this giant 40-foot statue called David. Most of us have probably seen it. Now, most of us know what a Jewish man in the 1000 BC circa looked like. And he didn't look like Michelangelo's David. And I don't even know that Michelangelo was even referring to the David of the Bible. What he shows in his sculpture is a Greek god. He shows a man. This statue is carved out of a piece of marble that most other people said was worthless. And he carved one of the greatest masterpieces of mankind. In fact, in it was placed in a room with a bunch of other Michelangelo carvings or sculptures that are titled Man Busting Out of Rock, or Man Coming Forth from the Rock, or something like that. And they are basically various developments of a sculpture of man going from just a lump of rock to an almost finished piece. And in the midst of this, with all of these around, is this 40-foot statue of Michelangelo. David, or 40-foot statue of David. Michelangelo's David is not circumcised, which was about as un-Jewish as you could get. He was also, his hands are very disproportionate to the rest of the statue. Not only is the statue larger than life, but the hands are larger than the rest of the statue. Which, the philosophy behind this, the mentality behind what he was demonstrating through the statue, is that the man is just really great. Man is just too cool. Here's proof. And what is the best thing about man is his hands. This is what he accomplishes things with. This is what he makes things happen with his hands. So David had these larger than life hands. He became less humanistic later on in his years, and this was probably due to the contact that he had with a woman, Italian, by the name of, make sure I get her last name right, Vittoria Colonna. Vittoria Colonna was a Reformationist. She really got into what Luther did, and she had a pretty good impact on Michelangelo in the later years. And so, and this is demonstrated in some of his writings. Someone asked me once when he did the Sistine Chapel, at what period in his life that was done, and I don't know. I've tried to find out the years from that, and I'm looking in the wrong places. So I don't know if that was something that he did during his humanistic years or later on during his redirection. Okay, any questions on Michelangelo? Yes, Liz?
Is her last name two N's?
Yes. 2 N's. Colonna. C-O-L-O-N-N-A. Okay. Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci, you see here on your outlines, he was the greatest genius of the Renaissance. But he was the kind of guy that not only did he do whatever he attempted to do good, but he did whatever he attempted to do gooder than anybody else. I mean, just whatever it was, whether it was science, whether it was mathematics, whether it was philosophy, whether it was art, whether it was music, whatever it was he got into, he became the best at. And in the subject of mathematics, one of the prevalent thoughts that developed in Greek philosophy is that if there is an absolute in the universe, then it can be found in mathematics or by applying mathematic principles. For example, when I was showing you earlier where you reduce something down where it has no dimensions, in geometry that's known as a point. Okay? Well, they would try to explain, and then then the next step in geometry, okay, you start off with a point, that's your beginning point. Then the next step is the shortest distance between 2 points is a line. Okay? That's basic geometry. Well, they would try to apply these same, and then you'd go to angles and then rays and planes and cubes and so on. Well, they would do the same approach to trying to figure out what man's purpose was by using these mathematical methods. And they never did quite succeed. And that's why they always thought, well, we haven't quite got it yet, but they will someday. Da Vinci tried this too in his philosophies, and by the end of his life was beginning to see that if this is really true, then man's nothing more than a machine, because mathematics is a very controlled absolute. And so he became very despondent in his whole view of philosophy. Either the attempts of man to philosophize why man is I mean, the whole direction man has gone has failed, or if he's right, then it's not a very good life, just to be a machine sort of thing. And so therefore he foresaw the danger that was happening in the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance was a very critical crossroad in human development. It was a point to where, as far as the thinking of man, it came to this crossroad, and one road went toward God. The Renaissance was man taking a look at himself. I mean, he just went to a mirror, and he took a real good, long, hard look into his eyes and said, "Who am I?" And his answer could have gone one of two ways. I am created in the image of Almighty God. And then fall down on his face before him. Or the direction it did take was, boy, those are pretty blue eyes I got. That's pretty cool. No wonder all the girls like me. And he just, he could have gone the other way, and that's the way man went. And so Da Vinci foresaw this danger. He saw what was happening through the Renaissance, whether it was through music or art or whatever, that the whole thing was just taking God, removing him out of the picture. Remember, prior to this time, all art was God. And it was during the Renaissance that the first, what you would call secular art, began to appear. And so Da Vinci saw that, and in fact, in the end of his life, when he was brought to France before the French king, I forget who the king was, but he was just a very despondent, what's the use type of guy. Now, not all of the writers and authors and artists, musicians of the Renaissance were this way. In fact, there's the famous painting of Raphael called The Raising of the Cross. And it shows Christ on this cross just as they were beginning to lift it up and drop it into the hole. And one of the guys that the main character in this painting that's lifting the cross up is a self-portrait of Raphael. And it was because of this introspection that man was doing, because he was looking at his eyes. Some of the guys began to think, man, I'm really a sinner. You know, that was me who I crucified Christ. And so he saw that, and the way he wanted to express that was by painting a self-portrait of himself doing that in the raising of the cross. So not all the Renaissance went that way, but by and large that was the force, or that was the path that it took, which led to these later times, which we'll talk about after the break with the Enlightenment. Any questions before we break, though? None? Okay. Let's take a break. Okay, before the break, we talked about the origins of secular humanism in the Greek philosophy, and then its rebirth in the 14th and 15th century with the Renaissance. Any questions over anything we've covered so far? Okay. So now, for the rest of the class, we'll take a look more at, from the Renaissance up to modern times, the development of what we would term as modern secular humanism. Was kind of a development of thought rather than something that just emerged on the scenes in the 1930s. And we'll begin with the Enlightenment, which took place during the 18th century, during the 1700s, after the wane of the Renaissance, with the Industrial Revolution having its beginnings, and mankind had colonized the world, and these new nations were springing up, and this, after a few centuries of man thinking for himself, man really began to feel like he was stuff. And this was is commonly known as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment period. It's a couple of centuries after the Reformation, and so we have multitudes upon multitudes of denominations throughout the world, and the iron fist of Rome has been broken by and large. And one of the main aspects of the Enlightenment from a Christian's point of view is what we could call the Pietist movement. The Pietist movement was reactionary. It was began by the man Philip Spener, and basically behind the Pietist movement, you know, as I said, the Reformation's been going on for a couple of centuries now, and everybody and his Aunt Tilly who's ever read the Bible all the way through found something to disagree with everybody else and their Aunt Molly, and so consequently I'll just start my own church. You know, I mean, if you don't want to have yellow flowers in the pulpit, then we'll just start our own denomination. And this was going on just rampantly worldwide. Many wars were fought over the issues, and whole nations, whole governments were formed, centered upon one theological or philosophical view. And in the midst of all of this confusion and turmoil came the Pietists. Basically, in the beginning, Pietism was a reaction against the liturgy and formalism of organized religion. You know, just the pomp and circumstance of Lutheranism, which, you know, Luther's Reformation, he didn't reform that aspect of the Catholic Church. I mean, just all of just the pomp and the liturgy of Catholicism was carried right on over into Lutheranism. Pietism was, in the beginning, a reaction against that. They stressed personal experience even over and above doctrine. or what we would call sound doctrine. It was very existential. In other words, an experience, if you had an experience with God, that was much more important than what the Bible had to say about what an experience with God constituted. And so this was even done at the expense of sound doctrine. It was Protestantism's turn inward. Even though in the beginning it might have had some good basis in turning away from the emphasis upon liturgy and placing the emphasis on a personal experience, which is not, who would deny the importance of a personal experience with God? But then when that personal experience became very subjective, and then the emphasis became on that subjectivity, and on and on and on. And then on the other hand, over here you had all of these scholars of the Enlightenment, who were reading the Greeks and were reading the Latins and were reading, all of the old dudes, and then coming up with their own ideas and their own philosophies and their own writings in a very scholarly fashion. The Pietists began to view all scholasticism as a bad thing, even biblical scholasticism. And a very bad thing to say to a pietist would be, well, in the Greek it says, because they didn't want to know what it said in the Greek, because that was to be considered, it was kind of like, when we first started the Bible college, I had heard, I heard a few negative comments about the Bible college from a few people who just really didn't know what we were doing here. And, comments about how, well, you're just producing a bunch of spiritual eggheads and things like that, and you're taking the emphasis off of the Spirit, and you're placing the emphasis on knowledge and just trying to learn a bunch of stuff rather than trying to take, the stuff and teach us how to have a deeper and more intimate walk with Christ. And this was kind of the Pietist view, that any kind of knowledge or any kind of scholarly approach to anything was considered to be worldly, even the Bible. And so therefore there was no such thing as sound doctrine. As the Pietist movement got deeper and deeper into it, they didn't worry about sound doctrine. All they worried about was their own personal experience. And most of us know when that happens, then bad doctrine creeps in, because everybody's own personal experience became their own absolute for God, and therefore there was nothing to judge. There was no objectivity to the Christian walk within them. The Moravian Church was a well-known aspect of Pietism. As far as it being a negative thing for the church, in the fact that they just removed themselves from any scholarship whatsoever, on the other, that was negative. But then even worse than that was the fact that it left scholarship to the heathens. There was still somebody around there that was willing to learn, and since the Pietists wouldn't, then the secular world did. And so that left the world open to any scholarly approach was non-Christian, and hence the Enlightenment. This was also the period that gave rise to the deist. The deist. Now, deists are good guys to understand, for tests and things like that. It's good to know who the deists were and what they believed. And basically, deism was the idea that God, Jehovah, this personal, loving, all-powerful God, created the universe, wound it all up, set it out there, and then just let it start spinning. And he just sat back and watched it. And he doesn't interfere into the affairs of men. He has no intercourse with man whatsoever. And he just kind of lets man make his own course. And consequently, one of the aspects of deism is that as man is watching man work out his own salvation on earth, if his good works outweigh his bad works, then he can work his way into heaven. And so it's just like any other view of salvation that the secular world has. Well, deism was very prevalent during this period because man was beginning to, look inward and look upon himself and beginning to see himself as his own source, even in the name of Christianity. This whole inward look of man was being applied to all aspects of life. And so they would say, yes, I'm a Christian, I'm a deist. And a lot of our founding fathers were deists. A lot of them weren't. A lot of them were very faithful believers in God, but a lot of them were deists. And deism was very prevalent, especially toward the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. It waned after that, though. When the United States, after the first couple of generations of America, there was quite a drop-off in deism. And then, of course, there was the Great Awakening of that same time period, which also contributed to that. One of the well-known deists of the age was John Locke, and he was an author who was probably best known for his work, The Reasonableness of Christianity. And he just looked at this whole thing of Christianity in a deist light and explained how reasonable it all was, that deism was true. Is what he called natural religion. This just makes sense. It's reasonable. It's natural. Some of the literature of the Enlightenment was Diderot's Encyclopedia, which was basically a summary of Enlightenment thought. It just he was the Enlightenment spokesman who took all of the great teachings of that century and summarized it in his encyclopedia. Probably the greatest figure of the entire Enlightenment era was Voltaire. There are a lot of guys even today who still bow to the feet of Voltaire. And Voltaire was a great thinker. He believed in God, and we'll put that in quotation marks, because and he said some things that weren't so bad. He thought that he drastically opposed the tyranny of organized religion, which doesn't sound too bad to me. I'm kind of opposed to the tyranny of organized religion too. Only his concept of organized religion was anything outside of what he conceived religion to be. It wasn't just going against some Christendom or some hierarchy of ecclesiastical values or anything like that. It was basically anything outside of my space is considered organized religion. So consequently, he believed that the worst book ever produced on earth was the Bible, and was very vehement in those views. In fact, he had a lot of predictions, and some of them were very good, such as the fact that it was absurd to think that man could ever travel 50 miles an hour, and some other things like that. And he also made a prediction about the Bible that he said, within a century of my death, the Bible will be obsolete and will be lost to mankind. He says, I give it another 100 years, and then it'll just be considered one of those great classics of yesteryear. Ironically enough, his house in France, just about 100 years after his death, was turned into a printing press for a World Bible Society. And there have been millions of Bibles printed within his house itself subsequently. Okay, some of the philosophy of the Enlightenment now. This is very fundamental, foundational to the secular humanism of today. The philosophy that was what we would call modern philosophy. Okay, there was a transition that took place in philosophy during this time period that brought it up to these were the fathers of 20th century philosophy, of which humanism is a member. The first of these guys, which goes back, we're going back before the Enlightenment now, but the first of what we would call the modern philosophical thinkers would be Descartes. You see it on the outlines. It's spelled Descartes, but it's pronounced Descartes. He was a French dude, and he is called by most the father of modern thinking. Although Francis Schaeffer, if you want to know more about the things that we've gone on tonight, this is an excellent book by Francis Schaeffer. This is probably the most scholarly work available on the subject of the rise of humanism. And this is called How Should We Then Live by Francis Schaeffer. And he traces the whole history of mankind from a philosophic standpoint as far as man looking at himself instead of God, trying to find answers. I mean, he kind of summarizes the course that we've taken from the philosophic point of view anyway in this book. And so if you want to get more into that, that's an excellent book to get into. But according to him, even though most people place Descartes as the father of modern thinking, he really kind of places him back with the old guys. And he sees the breaking point between the old dudes and the new dudes in this one aspect. And that is optimism versus pessimism. You spell pessimism anyway. Yeah. Optimism versus pessimism. Remember the old guys, even going back to Plato and Socrates and all those guys, they said, if I don't figure it out, my son will, or my grandson, or so on. Someday man's going to have the answers, and we won't wonder about oranges anymore. Well, their whole approach to explaining the reason for existence was very optimistic. And it was as though, the way Schaeffer explains it in his book, it was as though, okay, you got this one philosopher over here, and he says, here is a circle. And within this circle are the answers to mankind. And then somebody else would come along from a little different perspective and a little different point of view, and he'd say, no, we'll cross out that circle, and the circle's right here. And here are the answers to mankind. And everybody would kind of go, yeah, that looks pretty good, until someone else would come along a little bit later, and he'd go, no, here's the circle. And someone else later, no. And then so on and so forth from, Protagoras all the way up to, and here we are with Descartes. And so and everybody was optimistic. Well, this circle is going to pave this way to our answers. And so after several centuries of this, men began to look at that, and they began to think, man, this is nothing but a bunch of circles going in a circle. These guys are getting nowhere. And how can you be optimistic about that? There are no answers. There are no absolutes. There are no conclusions. There are no questions. So how can there be answers? And so on and so forth. And they begin to have a very pessimistic philosophy to mankind. So this is where Schaeffer kind of makes this distinction between the old dudes and the new dudes. And he kind of places Descartes in the middle, because Descartes was still fairly optimistic. Even though he looked at the circles and he began thinking that it sure doesn't seem to be going anywhere, he still thought that it would be someday. He is famous. I mean, this is the profundity of philosophy. He is famous for one important quote. I think, therefore I am. Okay? I think, therefore I am. In other words, because I can reason, because I am rational, then I have the ability to do that, and no other creature on earth can, but me as a man can. And so therefore, everything emanates from me. Again, very humanistic, very self-centered, very, I am that point. I am the particular that cannot be reduced any further. Okay, second dude, a little bit later, it was a guy by the name of Spinoza. And he was very influential in a lot of ways. His attempt at philosophy basically was an attempt to blend Christianity and pantheism. You know, which is what a lot of 20th century dudes try to do. You know, we talked about this last week with the New Age. And he tried to do this in a very simplistic way. Tried to show just kind of a Baha'ist approach, that Christianity is just another one of those roads, and that Jesus was really trying to say, you know, so on and so forth. So that's Spinoza. Aside from Descartes, well, no, not aside from Descartes, probably the most influential thinker of the Renaissance. I mean, this was the guy that probably had more to do to influence the thinking of man, about man, than ever. I mean, even more so than Plato and some of the other guys, is Rousseau, French guy. He was just right, I mean, he lived during the 18th century, 1712 to 1778, and he was, as I said, probably the most influential man on the outlook of man that ever was. He was pessimistic, but he thought that this whole Enlightenment era, you know, he was really saying, okay, man is, you know, now that man is beginning to say that there's no answers, you know, now that man is really on the right track in trying not to be so Pollyanna about the whole thing, and just trying to realize that, you know, maybe life is a drag after all. He thought that this was good. You know, he was optimistic about the fact that man can be pessimistic. And then after he did that for all of his life, his final conclusion was, you know, I think this whole thing of the Enlightenment was the wrong direction and did more harm than it did good. His view was that of, I've used this word several times tonight, and this is abstract. So I don't know if I can explain it, but I've used this word particulars. Particulars are individual things, okay? This table is a particular, okay? Opposed to particulars is the thing called universals, or you could say absolutes, but philosophers usually use the word universals. Okay, opposed to particulars, I could say that this is a table. And, okay, how do I know that that's a table? I mean, what constitutes a table? Is it a flat surface with four legs? Is that what constitutes a table? Then you could say, okay, all flat surfaces with four legs are tables, or can anything that is not a flat surface with four legs be a table? In other words, what universally constitutes a table? You know, can a table have three legs? Is it possible for a table to have three legs? Well, yes. Okay, then that is, you know, and this is what the whole thing of universals is all about. That you cannot, you know, I can say that this is a lectern. Well, why is it a lectern? I mean, there's a lectern back there in the back of the room that is shaped entirely differently than this one. And so is it just my opinion that this is a lectern? Even though I can be sure about particulars, but then when you start talking about universals, you know, you start getting into very abstract and very opinionated, and which, you know, can be non-consequential when we're talking about tables and lecterns, but then when you start talking about things like theology and philosophy and applying the same rules and regulations, it can become very important. And so this, and to a philosopher, they were saying there is no distinction, you know, as like Plato was saying, really my thoughts, my theology, my philosophy is more concrete than the physical surroundings around me. And you know, you take a philosophy course today, and usually one of the final exams is they'll have you to write an essay on prove to me that this table even exists. And I was talking to a guy here the other day, and he was telling about that, he knew a guy that was taking a college philosophy course, and the teacher gave out 1A. That was his final question. Prove to me that this table exists. And out of the whole class, he gave out 1A. And the guy that got the A wrote a 2-word essay. And his essay said, "What table?" And he got, that was the philosophy teacher's whole point. And so he's the one that got the A after everybody else spent all these, well, you got these wood, and you got this varnish. And they went to all these explanations to prove that table existed. And the philosopher was trying to say, that doesn't prove anything. I don't even know that thing's there. And by the guy agreeing with him, that he got the A. Okay, that's the whole approach to philosophy. As I said, it's abstract. It's almost comical in its approach. But when you look at the difference between particulars and universals, you can kind of see where they're coming from. Well, that's where all of these guys were. This is where they were at, and that's Rousseau. He was doing this distinction. He tried to take particulars and universals because, see, the whole thing with the Greeks was that they used as their starting point, their point that could be reduced no more, is that there is such thing as good, and we just know what's good. We just know it. They didn't worry about the fact that something had to tell us that. We do know that there is such thing as black and there is such thing as white, and we just know that intuitively. And so they used that as they called it reason. This is what Plato called reason and thought. That is the absolute in the universe. Well, the later thinkers began to say, well, no, you don't know that. You don't know that there's such thing as good. Is murder wrong? Well, yes. Okay, then is it wrong to kill someone who's trying to kill your wife? Is that wrong? And this sort of thing, that they would always give you a situation that would seem to contradict whatever absolute that you came up with. And so this is where all of this was happening. Okay, if Descartes was the beginner of all of this, modern thought, and Rousseau was the one that took it to its greatest heights, probably number 3 in this whole thing was Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's philosophy, basically all of your philosophers, whether you're talking about Plato or Descartes or Rousseau or Kant or any of them, basically it all comes back to these two things, trying to reconcile universals to particulars. And Immanuel Kant believed that by human effort this could be done. If I just eliminate the arguments between these two, just every time someone says, well, what about, and then they give, their argument, then eventually I'll just eliminate all the arguments until I can reconcile them. And he came up with his own terms, though. You see them on your outlines here, the noumenal and the phenomenal world. The noumenal world would be the universals that I have here on the bottom, and then the phenomenal world would be the world that can be measured, the particulars. This would be the empirical world, that which can be examined. Not necessarily the height and width of this table, but my own personal experiences. I know that there's light in this room because I'm here experiencing this light. But that would be the phenomenal world. The noumenal world will say, well, how do you know that it's light that you're seeing? And that sort of thing. So he tried to reconcile the two and believed that it could be done, but never did. And so he was also very despondent toward the end of his life. Okay, which brings us to the rise of religious humanism. And I use the word religious humanism for a very important reason. If you take your Humanist Manifesto that was passed out, you hear people talk about secular humanism. And as I said in the beginning, that this is actually a misnomer. This is a copy of the actual Humanist Manifesto 1. This is the first one that was written back in the 1930s by John Dewey and Asimov and Potter and all those guys. And this is their actual wording. I mean, this isn't some editor's wordings. Notice the first two words. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So by their own admission, humanism is not secular, it is religious. In fact, the Supreme Court has ruled on at least 2 occasions that it is indeed religious, that it is a religion. And so by its own, by its own founders, secular humanism is a misnomer. It's religious humanism. And so the rise of religious humanism, I guess, would have to be traced back to Charles Darwin. You remember we talked about him in the first week. Charles Darwin was the author of the book Origin of the Species, which was released on November 24th, 1859, and all 1,250 copies were sold on the first day. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin propounded what he viewed to be the theory of natural selection. Now, there are various views of natural selection. He wondered why, if you went up to the North Pole, you saw white bears, but you didn't see any brown bears or black bears. And so he thought, okay, natural selection must have ruled. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at that. One is the view that, well, if you took 3 bears up to the Arctic Circle, you took a white bear, a brown bear, and a black bear, the white bear would be able to sneak up on the little bunny rabbits. But the black bear and the brown bear wouldn't be able to, because the bunny rabbits would see them coming and they'd run away. Okay? So the natural selection of the environment would just allow for the black bear and the brown bear to die off of hunger. But the white bear would become very prolific, and it would do real well in that type of environment. Okay, this would be a very good view of natural selection. Darwin's view of natural selection was a little different than that, though. He said that, well, because there was a need for bears to be white, that the brown bears and the black bears that were up in the Arctic Circle eventually began to have lighter colored babies because they just needed to be that way. And so then their babies, these lighter colored babies, grew up and they had even lighter colored babies until finally at some point in time they were white. I don't know what they did for food during this time while all this was happening, but this was his explanation of what natural selection was all about. Darwin did believe in God. He considered himself to be a Christian, but a scientist. In fact, he explained several times that his work was not an attempt to disprove the existence of God, but it did pave that way. He didn't believe necessarily that man was responsible to God, even though he believed in God, that man wasn't accountable or responsible to him in any way. He thought that man, as a result of his work and his whole thing of natural selection and the origin of the species and the evolution of man, if man is simply a matter of chance, which he believed he was, kind of a deistic point of view, if man is simply a matter of chance, then he has to only answer to himself. Again, we're back to man being that center, being the focal point, and everything being evaluated in light of who man is rather than who God is. Okay, one of his greatest admirers was Thomas Huxley. Remember, we talked about him in the first week too. He was the guy who, after Origin of the Species hit the market, Thomas Huxley was the guy who thought this was so great. In fact, a subsequent book of Darwin's was The Descent of Man. In Origin of the Species, Darwin didn't go so far as to say we came from monkeys. He was a little leery of saying that, but about 20 years later, when he came out with The Descent of Man, he finally said, yes, we all slimed up out of the ocean, cosmic bang, wow, and here we are. And, yeah.
Where did God fit in there then? If you believe in God, but yet man come from monkey, where was the creation in his mind?
Evolutionary theism. that God used evolution.
Or do you believe God did not create man, but he created the world, the cosmos, and through evolution, man was finally created?
Yeah, and to what degree God oversaw this, I don't know in his mind. There are varying degrees of God's sovereignty in the matter. And then you got to come back to the point of, well, what exactly is God? You know, who is God to Charles Darwin? I mean, everybody has concepts of God. You know, I'd hate to be thought of as a concept, but everybody has concepts of God, and Darwin had his. And exactly what that was, I don't know. He reiterated over and over again that he believed in God, whatever that means. Thomas Huxley didn't, though. And he loved the idea of, Huxley was a pantheist, and he loved this idea that we came from monkeys. In fact, he was the one who took the chart of showing, he developed the skeletal progression of man, going from these little bitty knuckle-dragging monkeys on up to these sloop-shouldered, and then, you know, to the guy wearing the silk top hat. And he was a biologist, and he was the one probably most responsible for popularizing Darwin's work. When Darwin first hit the scene, I mean, he created an uproar, and the public didn't know what to think. And remember, it wasn't until the 20s with the Scopes trial that the public reception of Darwinism began to change. So it's only been in the last 50 years that there's been any kind of a change. But Huxley, in the last part of the 19th century, was probably most responsible for that. Another philosopher of the day that was big into Darwinism was Herbert Spencer, also in the latter part of the 19th century. And he's the one that coined the phrase, survival of the fittest. Now, he took this natural selection of Darwin, you know, the fact that only the creatures that are most suited, most fitted to any particular environment will survive. Either they will adapt, evolve, or die. Okay, that was Darwin's premise. Spencer took it even further into saying, yes, survival of the fittest, that means whoever's the most fit has the right to survive. And you can begin to see this fascist mentality, this rise in Aryanism begin to come from it. In fact, Himmler, this was Heinrich Himmler, this is where he came from. This was his school of thought. You've heard of the Marquis de Sade, you know, where we get our word sadism. He was a disciple of Spencer's. In fact, he was quoted as, or he did write, that since man is stronger, meaning man as opposed to women, since man is stronger, therefore he has the right to make women do anything he wants them to do. And he is very well noted for the things that he used to do to women in his home. And this is you know, you can see the way that, you know, it began with Darwin, and then the guys took it a little further, and then when Spencer got it, yes, Don.
I'm just going to add that this is also the law of the jungle, the law of the streets, and the law of jails, and everything else. When man is at his basest, it's whoever's strong survives, and all the weak are left to fall. I mean, the mafia, I mean, all the lowest forms of mankind, jails, prisons, streets, that's the rules.
That's an interesting comment, too, backing up some to Rousseau, when you talk about man being at his basis. He believed that it was kind of like man started off pure. Man in his primitive state was much better off than man in his enlightened state, you know, of the 18th century. And believed this, I mean, he thought that it was the rules and regulations and the authority and the societal taboos and all of these structures and civilization that we have done to ourselves that has produced the problems. And that if man could just go back to that club-toting Stone Age era at his most base primitive state, that was the answer to all things. And so consequently he was fairly hedonistic in a lot, and where he wasn't, his disciples really were. In fact, I forget the guy's name, but one of his biggest disciples, left his family and his friends and did his own pilgrim's progress, where he got on a boat and moved to, he wanted to, well, where's the most primitive place I can go? I know, Tahiti. And so he was an artist, real famous artist of the Enlightenment, and he went and lived in Tahiti, just wanted to get naked with the natives for a while, and he figured that was what it was all about. And came home a very dejected man, because they had more suffering, they had more problems, they had more disease, and so he saw that wasn't what it was all about. And yeah, that is, it does seem to be, it's almost a contradiction in terms among the philosophers, because the idea is to return to anarchy, and then at the same time, on the other hand, they have, remember the word that I threw out last week, meliorism, that we are going to make this a better place to live just by working harder at it. But then when the philosophers say, yeah, and the way we make it a better place to live is to do away with all the rules and regulations. And another guy in that vein of thought was this Auguste Comte. It's spelled C-O-M-T-E, but it's pronounced C-long-O-N-T, Comte. Auguste Comte. And he believed, this is the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, we've got things like railroads, and we've got telegraph, and we've got telephone now, and they're even beginning to think about how man's going to fly, and having all these contests for who can be the first one to fly so far, and just all of these things. Man is really a scientific whiz now, and so he believed that was the answer, that all of men's problems could be found through science. Just build a bomb so big that no one would threaten you. That mentality. And he also believed that this could be done through a non-theistic religion. And what is the more epitomized as a non-theistic religion than in the Humanist Manifesto? He thought that this is what man needs more than anything else, is a non-theistic religion. If we can do that as a philosophy, a religion of humans, and then place all of our attentions on science and technology, we don't have to worry about destroying our ozone. We'll just build a new one, because we'll have the technology to do it. And this was his whole thing. And so that was Auguste Comte. Okay, John Dewey. John Dewey was made the honorary president of the NEA in 1932. He is known as the father of progressive education. And by progressive education, remember, think back to your concept of the little one-room schoolhouse, with the schoolmaster and the students and the schoolmaster's ruler and the textbooks, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the memorizing of dates and events and rivers and lands and just all of that, information in and information out as you become quizzed on it. And there was never any attempt for creativity. There was no self-expression. There was no allowance for reasoning, for a person to take a problem and think through it and come to a conclusion. It was just all information in, information out. That was the former approach to education. Dewey was the first one who began to think, man, you got to let these kids express themselves. You got to give them an opportunity to say they don't like something. You got to let them think for themselves. And so his reaction to the strict curricular education of the old school was to begin to pave the way for the Benjamin Spock school. The fact that you never tell them anything is wrong. You just let them do whatever they want to do, and so on. And he was also the chief designer of the Humanist Manifesto 1, which is the one that I passed out. this is the Humanist Manifesto 1, just the basic 15 tenets of the humanists, the secular or religious humanists. They have since penned the Humanist Manifesto 2, which is much more in-depth, and it takes very specific political stances on issues such as abortion and other social issues and so on. And it's very expansive. It's several pages long, of which I don't have a copy and I haven't read it. I've seen it before and read parts of it, but it's pretty involved. But he was one of the chief designers of the Humanist Manifesto 1. Some of the other signers, Charles Potter, educator back in the 30s, who is probably best known by his quote, "Education is the most powerful ally of humanism." That's the first half of it. Education is the most powerful ally of humanism, comma. Okay? Education is the most powerful ally of humanism. And every American public school is a school of humanism. And every American public school is a school of humanism. Now, this was the focus of, remember, Dewey was the honorary president of the NEA back in 1932. And so we can see the goal of the leaders of the National Education Association back a generation ago was to teach humanism in the public schools. That was their goal. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. In fact, one of the keynote speakers at the NEA conference about 5 or 6 years ago made the statement that every child entering public schools at the age of 5 has a mental illness. And he has this mental illness because he has this misguided loyalty toward God, family, and country. And then he goes on to say, it's up to us as educators to heal those sick minds. So this is the as I said last week on the New Age movement, that the humanist philosophy is waning in that it's not answering the problems. Meliorism is failing. We've had the world wars, and we've had the ozones, and we've had the Chernobyls, and on and on and on and on and on, as well as the heartbreak of psoriasis and AIDS and everything else that we can't find cures for. And so that's why this big, thing over to the spiritual side of the New Age movement and that thing. But the educators, the people that are teaching are still clinging to humanism. And it is very big, and we can see the evidences of it in the quotes of some of these guys, what they are saying, not what Christians say about them, but what they are saying about themselves. Okay, another prevalent signer of the Humanist Manifesto is a very well-respected man by the name of Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov, any science fiction writer is familiar with his works. I happen to have here Isaac Asimov's Guide to the Bible, the Old Testament. What this is an Old Testament commentary written by an atheist, a commentary on the Bible. And this will just show you some of a humanistic mentality as far as his approach to the Bible. First of all, when you read the cover page, and it just tells you about, what a great work this is of literature and everything, and how scholarly and in-depth it is, and so on. Let me just read a couple of things, a couple of comments that he has to say. This is what he says about, this is talking about Isaiah 14, where the whole thing about Lucifer and how mighty, how thou art fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, and so on. And this is some of his comments about that. He's trying to explain Isaiah's writings and so on. He says, by New Testament times, the Jews had developed in full detail the legend that Satan had been the leader of the fallen angels. He has this in quotes. These were the angels who rebelled against God by refusing to bow down before Adam when that man was first created, and using as their argument that they were made of light and man only of clay. Then he goes on to say a little bit later, he said, the Jews have come under Greek influence, and they may have perhaps been swayed by the Greek myths concerning the attempts of the Titans and later the giants to defeat Zeus and assume the mastery of the universe. Both the Titans and the giants were defeated and imprisoned underground. So naturally the Jews would develop that same sort of mentality for Lucifer and his fallen angels. In fact, he goes on to say that the statement about Lucifer may have even helped to give rise to the legend about the Titans and the giants, that maybe, they were listening to the myths of the Jews. Okay, another quote. I just wondered what he had to say about Cyrus. When Isaiah prophesied about Cyrus coming back, of course I knew what he'd have to say, but I wanted to look it up and see what his own words were. So he says concerning Isaiah 45:1, here's the verse, thus saith the Lord to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue the nations before him. Okay, this was a prophecy given by Isaiah almost 100 years, about 75 years before the birth of Cyrus. And he even mentions him specifically by name. And so I wondered, well, how is an atheist going to approach this? So he says, it is possible to argue, if one is wedded to the literal word of the Bible, that the Isaiah of Hezekiah's time foresaw the period of the exile in great detail, Hezekiah being pre-exilic. So he's saying that it's possible to argue, if you really hold to the literal word of the Bible, that the Isaiah of Hezekiah's time had some pretty good insight into the exile. Great detail, down to the names and the deeds of the monarch, who was to establish the Persian Empire and liberate the Jews, and that he spoke his vision in a style that was altered from what it had been. Okay, then he goes on to say, this point of view, however, has no important advocates today. In other words, no one of any sense would actually believe that today. It is assumed instead that a prophet of the period of the exile, in other words, after this had already taken place, after Cyrus had already said go back and rebuild, it's assumed that a prophet of the period of the exile wrote under the honored name of Isaiah, and that since he was every bit as great a poet as Isaiah, if not actually greater, his work was included with that of the earlier prophet in the present book of Isaiah. And so it comes to pass that the great prophet of the exile, certainly one of the more influential voices of history, is doomed to complete anonymity forever, and can be referred to only as second Isaiah, or using the Greek term for second as the Deutero-Isaiah. So in other words, this couldn't have been, there's no way that this could be the same author as wrote in the first of the book, because otherwise it would have to be a miracle. And then, as I said, the Humanist Manifesto too, which was penned about a decade ago. Also, as I said, humanism has been declared a religion by the Supreme Court on at least 2 occasions, but is openly taught in the public schools. I mean, without apology and without any attempts to hide the fact, as we can see from the quotes of its adherents. So in closing, just to summarize, I know we've got a lot into some abstract and esoteric philosophy. That's the foundations of humanism, though. It's almost as though, well, we'll just make it so confusing that it makes no sense. And anything that we can do to keep from having to be accountable to somebody higher than ourselves. And that was Lamech's attempt. And corporately, that's what happened in the Tower of Babel. Philosophically, that's what happened to the Greeks and on down through to where here we are in 1980s and subsequent. Any questions? Okay, let's close with a prayer. Father, we recognize that true humanism, mankind understanding who he is in his truest form, can only be done in light of your glory and your grace and your love. That we have been created in your image, and that is a magnificent thing. And that we are really something to behold. Just the physical plant of humanity is just such an awesome thing. But it's nothing compared to your glory. And all of the universe, Lord, is measured by the span of your hand. And all of the nations are just a speck of dust compared to you. And we praise you for that. And we pray for those who refuse, Lord, who constantly refuse to acknowledge it. Pray that you would continue to work through your Spirit to reveal yourself to them, and that we would be those ready tools, that you might work through us, so that you could be revealed to a lost and dying world. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.